They're not dead. They want you understand? They want you as a host. Get away.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Odd Virginia. My name's Alex Koska, and I'll be your host for the show. Today we're going to be doing something just a little bit different. I have this episode in the back pocket, recorded and ready to go, just in case I wasn't able to get a guest for the week. And I guess because this is posted now, this is the week that I didn't have a guest lined up. So today what I'm doing is I'm just going through Reddit, and I'm going to be reading first-hand accounts of people who've had weird experiences within Virginia. I've tried messaging a lot of these people to see if I could get them to actually relay their story themselves, firsthand, their voice, and unfortunately I haven't gotten very many responses, so it's going to be me doing the reading. But before we get on to that, I just wanted to say, if you have any sort of odd experiences within the realms of Virginia, if you have any UFO sightings, paranormal encounters, or if you know about any local legends or strange history, go ahead and send me an email at oddvirginia@protonmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to have you on the show to relay your story to everyone who's listening this season. So yeah, go ahead and send that email to oddvirginia@protonmail.com, and we'll get in touch. We'll get you set up, put you on the show, because here at Odd Virginia,
we're ready to believe you!
Alright, so I'm going to be reading a couple stories from r/paranormal off of the website Reddit. I've compiled a number of different stories that happened in Virginia, and they'll be sure to chill your bones. Let's go ahead and get into our first story. This one is posted by B Baby Turns Blue. The post is entitled, "Got lost in the woods for 8+ hours as a little girl, and saw something unexplainable." I grew up in a densely forested rural area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, 10 at the time of this story, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened on was a very rare find, and the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim around in, and had nice soft mossy banks on either side to rest on after we tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads, no mosquitoes, because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack lunch the next day so we could have a picnic on the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning we set out for the woods at around 1 p.m., planning to have the picnic first and swim after. We entered at the same spot we had the previous day, and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before, so being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around there for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at one another from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set back out to find the creek. As we walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about a half hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an entire overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, and bathtub all sitting arranged together and covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird shit like this in the middle of the woods, so we walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home, or out of the woods at least. I told her we should follow the sun, and eventually we would come up on a road or someone's property where we could find help. She insisted on another way, and we began yelling at each other, out of fear, and let's be honest, little girl bossiness. I told her if she thought she was so right, she should just go her way, and we would see who got out first. So we split up. Now, as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat, and also an idiot. Worst possible thing we could have done. Not 10 minutes after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend deciding to go my way after all, I slow down so she can catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was matched my pace. I slow down, it slows down. I stop, it stops. This went on for hours, The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head, or there was really something following me. I picked up a big stick, swung it a few times just to make sure it was sturdy if I had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, I came up on something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I had just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the same setting sun, west, the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and screamed my little heart out while smacking my whoop-ass stick repeatedly into the ground. As I tried to collect myself, I heard the footsteps again, walking up on me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could. No answer. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Now this is the truly horrifying part which I typically omit while telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to see the darkest, deepest cloud I've ever seen in my life. In the middle, it was so black it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sound of bells was coming through the hole in the cloud. They were deafeningly loud. I mean, really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sense of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in all my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away from whatever the hell that cloud was, no one would ever see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run toward the thing chasing behind me either, though, so I made a sharp right and took off away from both. It was now completely dark and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through branches, wheezing, and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour, until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard, all the air in my lungs was knocked out of me. As I lay there trying to recover, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark, and I realized what had just made me go ass over teeth was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough it did. I walked over to a hill about a mile to the back of the farmhouse, explained what had happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life, but I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through my front door. My friend had gotten back shortly after we split, and figured I had as well, so hadn't told anybody I was lost, and my family just figured I was still out after dark, which wasn't uncommon for me. They were shocked when I walked in beat up and crying. Nobody had ever looked for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late. Thank you to Reddit user BBabyTurnsBlue for that story. I was actually able to get in touch with this user, and she let me know that the encounter actually happened in Spotsylvania County. Just a little extra bit of information on top of all that, but yeah, really just absolutely mind-boggling story with perhaps a bipedal creature following behind that was never seen, the skies opening up to ringing bells. Who knows whatever that could have been. Really makes you stop to wonder though, doesn't it? When people go missing in forests, where are they going? What is it that's possibly taking them? No one knows. Our next story comes from a user named GroundbreakingPen925, entitled, I Wish I Could Forget. Before I start, let me clarify that I have a well above average memory. In fact, when I remember things, I relive them. The oldest memory I have is from when I was 3 years old, back in 1997. This experience, however, is in 1998. This memory is in Norfolk, Virginia. It's night, very late, close to midnight, no earlier than 10 p.m. My mom grabbed me from the car and carried me to the front door. There was me, my sister, my mom, and my dad. Then, across the street in the neighbor's yard, a blue, glowing, male-shaped humanoid figure. Its glow didn't illuminate anything, though. It walked oddly, like a poorly made walking animation. Every few steps it would freeze, then continue walking again after a second or two. Even if it was standing on one leg, it froze mid-walk. I made my family aware of it. My sister, who's 2 years older than me, tried passing it off as headlights. My parents saw it, but said not to worry about it, and is most likely nothing. We did go inside very quickly when the front door was unlocked. My sister immediately went to sleep. I had insomnia back then, still do, so I stayed up with my parents. They eventually got tired too. They went to bed about 30 minutes later. I was allowed to still stay up, as, again, I have really bad insomnia, even at that age. My sister and I were raised as adults, so my parents knew I'd go to bed when ready. Shortly after they left, I felt like I was being watched. Interesting fact, humans have the ability to sense they're being watched, even if they don't know it, or unable to see the individual watching them, mind you. By this time, I wasn't thinking of that thing anymore. I looked behind me, where there is a window to the front yard, and there it was, standing there, on the other side of the glass. I've grown up used to paranormal, as it's been a regular part of my life. I've never seen anything like this, though. How'd I react? Well, I didn't scream and run off to my own or my parents' room. How I reacted was I just turned the TV off and quickly walked to my bedroom that I shared with my sister and hid under my blanket till I passed out. Most people I've told have been openly skeptical, not only due to how young I was, but also I didn't react the way a 3-year-old is supposed to react. More like expected to, in a situation like that. I'm autistic. Of course I would have reacted differently than expected, and of course I would remember it so vividly. However, this isn't something I'd lie about. Despite never seeing it or anything like it again, I wish I could forget. Thank you to Groundbreaking Pen 925 for posting his disturbing recollection. Don't know what it is about these apparitions that sometimes appear, and don't feel like they belong in this reality. Whether they're moving at what seems like a low frame rate or just like they're not comfortable in a human form. I had also seen something very similar at a similar age. I was young, looking out my window as streaks of lightning crashed above the forest. And I remember one particular flash of lightning lit up the sky, and the lightning bolt looked like it was the shape of a man, almost like a blue genie from Aladdin. Now maybe it was just pareidolia. My mind wanted to see the shape of a man in a lightning flash, but I've never been able to make much sense of it. Our next story comes to us from a user named Everyman a Wildcat, and the story is entitled The Knocks in Virginia Beach. This story is absolutely true and happened to me just a couple of years ago. I've told my friends, but never sat down and documented it all in writing. In December 2012, I joined the Navy. In March of 2014, I moved from one technical school in Great Lakes, Illinois, to another technical school in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The first few months in Virginia, I was assigned to a short-term housing situation, a place called the Navy Gateway. It was basically a hotel, but with one bed per unit. It was pretty nice, as when I wasn't in school, I spent most of my time out on the pier doing things outside with friends, so I didn't spend much time in my room there except to sleep. A few months into school, I got hit with orders to relocate my living situation to an older barracks. Building 508 was one of the oldest buildings on the base, but the rooms were laid out much differently, and the closets were much bigger. The carpet was older, and the sheets and amenities were no longer provided, but I was glad. I had plenty of stuff and wanted less involvement with base workers anyway. I had 6 months left on base, and I'd much rather live somewhere I can decorate and feel like is a miniature apartment. Though my daily cleaning service wouldn't come any longer, now I wasn't stuck with mandatory crappy cable that was already in the Navy Gateway. I had a cable company come out and wire my room with the loaded digital cable and Wi-Fi package. I spent more time in this room now, since some of my friends had left for other duty stations. The ceilings were about 10 feet, and I had way more shelves. The only downside was that my fan and overhead light didn't work with the wireless remote that was by the door. Each unit has 2 bedrooms, with closing locking doors. They share a common area with a bathroom, fridge, cabinets, and a small sink area. The first day I moved over, I remember the door to room 320A. I had the other bedroom, 320B. It was closed. I did a quick inspect and discovered a wet towel hanging on the rack, moisture in the sink, and then soon after a voice in the other bedroom. Damn, I thought. I was hoping to have the unit to myself, so I spent the rest of the afternoon migrating my things from Gateway to 508. On the second trip back to 508, there was a strong aroma of freshly sprayed cologne. With armfuls of bags, I didn't want to have to keep digging out my key card to open my bedroom door, so I locked the deadbolt to keep the door propped open. About the fourth trip over, after opening the front door into the common space, I noticed my door had been shut. The deadbolt was put back in, and the door was closed and latched, with my wallet in the bedroom. Oh, great. My roommate is an inconsiderate boob, I thought. So I walked to the building responsible for assigning key cards, which was unfortunately not that close to 508, and asked to be let back into my room. The gal at the front desk and I walked back across the base together, and she let me in. I told her I'm sorry. The guy who lives in Unit A must have closed the door for some reason. To which she replied, "Nobody lives in A." I told her that that can't be, and explained everything that had happened. So I took her master key and opened the door to that room. Bare bones. The mattress was flipped up, the drawers pulled out and empty. Everything was just as it should be for a new resident to move in. Turns out I did have the unit to myself. So that freaked me out. Fast forward a few weeks and fall was moving in. I love fall and cool crisp air, so at nighttime, I'd crack my window open. Sure, it would get too cold by morning, but I love waking up when it's 58 inside and the heater is off. Well, I continued this tradition every night until one night it got really cold. It was probably 40 outside and not much warmer inside. I was startled awake sometime after midnight by 3 knocks on my door. Quick, friendly knocks, mind you. This came from the outside of my bedroom door, not the unit. So it was in the kitchen or common area. I thought I maybe imagined it. So I waited for about 15 seconds and it happened again. I got up thinking that someone is obviously wanting to speak with me. I opened the door. Nobody there. Right after it closed, 3 knocks. I thought maybe it was coming from the hallway. So I opened the door again and walked through the common area and checked the peephole in the hallway. Nothing. I went back to my room and looked around. Could there be something loose or swinging or creaking? An animal in the wall? I walked around the room, quietly looking and listening for anything. Nothing. Nothing happened for another minute or two, so I went back to bed. The second I pulled the covers up over me, 3 knocks again. Definitely had to be on my door, no question about it. So I walked up to the door, but I didn't open it. I just looked at it. 3 more knocks. 10 more seconds of staring. 3 more knocks. At this point, it really hadn't even crossed my mind that it could be a ghost, so I was just so unbelievably baffled at what could be causing this. The room was still cold from my opening the window all night, but a combination of realizing that I think it's a ghost and maybe feeling some of the energy shift, I absolutely shuddered. It must have been 20 degrees in that room just then. Realizing that something bigger than me was at work here, my attitude shifted dramatically right then. My demeanor went from an aggressive, "oh my god, shut up," to a very submissive, "what can I do to not have a horror movie made about me?" It was then that I realized that maybe there's a ghost of someone just like me here. Someone not happy with the way their life in the Navy was. Someone who wished they hadn't enlisted. Someone who felt trapped. Or was it someone who was cold? I felt like a genius who discovered a new way to make a baby stop crying. I ran over to the window and shut it. The knocking stopped. I felt much more comfortable, and the mood in the room instantly brightened up. And for some reason, it felt like this was a peaceful spirit, or at least one who didn't want to bother me. I, of course, had to test this theory over the coming months. Window open always got the 3 knocks, and they always stopped when I'd shut it. I'd have friends over to hang out, tell them and then show them, and they were all supremely freaked out. I was totally comfortable with it all by then. I found it amusing. So one day, I was on the phone with my dad, pretty upset about the way things had been going regarding my studies, and then I explained that I thought I was living with a ghost. And though the ghost seemed friendly, I wasn't comfortable with it. That instantly dropped the temperature in my room. I knew the ghost was upset that I was speaking about him as if they weren't there, and I addressed that on the phone in real time and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, I know you're here." And right then, the temperature went back to normal, and the light that hadn't worked for 6 months kicked on, illuminating my room far brighter than the lamps I'd been using ever had. I'm not sure anyone else's take on this, but I was certainly convinced by all the experiences that there were spirits among us, and sometimes they aren't evil. Once again, that was Every Man of Wildcat, recalling his time at the Virginia Beach Navy base, where he was rooming with a benign spirit. Now that the weather is changing, if you live down at the 508, you might want to keep your windows closed. Our next story comes to us from user GothQueen0892, and the story is entitled, "In the Dark," he said, "I'm clean now." I grew up in Virginia, and my parents' home was in a small suburb near Winchester and Front Royal. I was 19 years old, visiting from college, and my parents were both out. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Every single light in the house stayed on except for the one in the room where I was watching TV. The TV shut off. The lights in the room shut off, but the hallway and downstairs lights remained on. There was no power outage, or else everything would have shut off. So I will never make sense of what happened. Each individual light in the room shut off, and in the corner of the room there was this man standing there, with dripping clothes, shoulder-length hair, and dirt all over his face. By the time I could blink, he was 2 inches from my face, standing over me, almost hovering. I was in shock and not able to move. He whispered to me, "I'm clean now." And I screamed and closed my eyes because my legs felt paralyzed and I wasn't able to run. I opened my eyes and the room was still dark, but the man was gone. I was finally able to move to get towards the door, and the light switch was turned off. I'll never make sense of this, not be able to understand how the television also turned off, or what was the purpose of the man's presence, what his words could mean. But it has been 10 years, and I still can't shake that event and wonder if anyone has any ideas or any similar stories to this that could help me shed some light to what exactly it was that I experienced. Thank you to GothQueen0892 for sharing that horrifying recount of what happened at your parents' house. Sounds to me like the ghost was lost, probably fresh out of the shower. Unfortunately, he missed a spot. By your description, his face was dirty. So he didn't know it, and he's not clean now. I'm really sorry that happened to you. That sounds utterly horrifying. I hope you're able to find the answers that you seek. Our next story comes from an account called RVA Throwaway. This is posted as a comment in a thread entitled, "Any Experiences in Virginia?" I'm generally a skeptic, but can't resist passing on some Virginia ghostliness that I've had brushes with. My family has been in the Richmond area since the 1600s. I have lived in Virginia most of my life, the majority in Richmond. First, a story that has been told many times in my family. My mom, grandma, and grandpa lived in a house in the 50s that had been built over top the area formerly occupied by the notorious Libby prison. My grandpa was a huge skeptic and poo-pooed any notion of paranormal activity. He bought the house for a very low price because apparently it had a reputation. My mom told me that the real estate agent showed them a closet in the house that had a very old-timey walking stick or cane in it. They were told never to touch or move it. They would hear the cane rattling around in the closet the whole time they lived there. Other things happened. My mom was a child, and the main thing that freaked her out was hearing marching and drums and soldiers, etc., going through the downstairs living room at night. And of course, when they went to look, no one was there. Fast forward to the recent past. I lived literally right next to Hollywood Cemetery. We had a loose spot in the chain-link fence surrounding the cemetery, and were able to easily get in or out any time. So much exploring was done. The creepiest thing I noticed was in the Confederate Soldiers Monument. That's the big pyramid made of rocks that are fitted together. Sometimes, even on a hot day, there are cold spots around those rocks. The weirdest thing that happened to me personally occurred while living near the cemetery. I was asleep in bed and woke up around 2 a.m. for no reason. I looked up, and there was a young man dressed as a soldier, standing at the foot of my bed looking at me. He was clearly wearing a uniform, but the clothes were really raggy looking. He had strips of cloth wrapped around his lower legs. He just looked really beat. I was totally speechless. I couldn't manage to say anything or yell, but as soon as he noticed me noticing him, he turned and ran towards my door. As he was running, he faded away. Once I pulled myself together from seeing that, I was really frightened. I think I was too shocked to be scared while it was happening. I didn't turn the light off or sleep for the rest of the night. Currently, I live in a late 1800s house just north of downtown. We all routinely hear people talking when nobody else is home, or hear what sounds like people moving around. Our kids spent most of their childhoods here, and there's a spot downstairs they avoided their whole lives. They've always just insisted it was creepy. This is not typical behavior for them. Our daughter is almost in her 20s and still won't go in that room alone at night. We also notice there's a spot upstairs that the dog fixates on. She stares at and circles around what looks like nothing. So there's my little Virginia contribution. That was a comment written by RVA Throwaway on the Any Experiences in Virginia thread under Our Paranormal. And you would expect, in places like Richmond and Williamsburg, to be just rife with ghosts of the Civil War. Based on stories I've heard, they do not disappoint. This is just one example. But also on that same thread, we have another comment, which turns into a pretty long story by a user named Chichi_loves me. Many people don't believe in the numerous paranormal encounters I have experienced in my childhood home, but they have shaped the person that I am today. There's some background information you should know before I delve into my experiences. I live with my mother, grandma, and grandpa in a large 2-story house in Manassas, Virginia. We were located a stone's throw away from the Bull Run battlefield. Literally, I could step off my front porch and in 10 strides be in the trails. Now, the battlefield of First Manassas, or the First Battle of Bull Run, was basically fought in my backyard and the surrounding woods. The Stonewall Jackson Memorial was about a half a mile down the road from our home as well, as the old brick school building repurposed as a wartime hospital for injured soldiers. As a kid, I would go with my grandpa metal detecting. Over the years in our backyard alone, we found numerous spent bullets from muskets, buttons from Confederate Union uniforms, and loads of Native American arrowheads and old pottery. Now on to some of the creepy things my family, myself, and a handful of our guests have witnessed or heard or felt. As a child, I slept in my mother's bed until I was 13, and the only reason I stopped was because we moved away from that house. This is a story that is kind of creepy, but honestly it gives me almost a sense of a guardian angel or something of the sorts. I don't have any recollection of this, but my mother just loves to retell this incident to me. Apparently, I was about 4 years old and didn't sneak into my mother's room the night before. That morning, she told me how proud she was that I slept in my own bed like a big girl. My response was, "The nice man came and tucked me in and told me not to be afraid because he was watching over me." She was a bit freaked out, but it didn't seem sinister, unlike some of the other events in our home, and didn't push me for much info. I also used to hear my name called around the house and barn. It was almost like someone calling from far away. I remember asking my grandma if she'd been calling for me, but she had not. She also confided in me that she heard her name called sometimes as well. Over the years, we all heard ourselves being called, but just tried to dismiss it. My mom and I had the downstairs to ourselves, and my grandparents lived upstairs. They would go on trips a lot for stamp shows, leaving my mother and I the run of the house. Almost every time they were gone for a few nights, weird things would start happening. We would hear the TV and radio turn on upstairs, but once we went to check it out, there wouldn't be anything on. We could also hear tons of footsteps going all through the upstairs, as well as the toilets flushing. At night, our dog would lay over our legs and continuously growl at the ceiling. It was so creepy, seeing as she was a very sweet dog and hardly ever took to growling. My mom and her 3 siblings had lived in the house as kids or teenagers and had tons of creepy stuff happen. My uncle was sleeping downstairs in bed and woke to a man standing at the end of his bed. He literally had to run past this quote-unquote man up the stairs and into his parents' bedroom. He told my grandpa what he had seen. Grandpa grabbed an aluminum baseball bat and headed downstairs. Now, the previous owners had a schizophrenic son, so my grandpa assumed he was having an episode and made his way back to the house in a confused state. Once downstairs, they checked all the rooms, but to no avail. He then asked my uncle what the man looked like. His description was of a young man in a gray uniform with no hands or feet. His description closely resembled a Confederate soldier. This was not the last time he was seen in the house. My grandpa used to be a huge skeptic and only believed in what could be explained by science and fact. Well, he was reading the paper in bed one night, only to look up from the paper and see the aforementioned man by the foot of the bed. He stood there for a moment and slowly faded away. Well, needless to say, this made my grandpa rethink a few things. He also saw him many years later when walking by the open guest bedroom upstairs. The soldier was just sort of hovering over the bed and disappeared. My grandpa is now a strong believer in spirits. This story, told to me by my aunt, brings tears to my eyes every time I retell it or think about it. She was a young teenager and loved to take her horse out for night rides in the national park next to her house. Well, she was in an open field surrounded by trees, riding her horse in large circles, when he began to freak out. She thought at first that maybe he spotted a bobcat or a cougar, but quickly dismissed that theory when an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. It was then that she spotted it, a hulking black figure in the branches of a tree between her and the trail home. She described it as being like a huge man, but completely shrouded in blackness with a glare she could feel piercing through her. His presence was of pure evil. She decided to nope the fuck out of there and rode as quickly as possible past it. When she arrived in our front yard, it was there waiting for her in the fruit trees on the property. My aunt had her horse race to the barn, and she put him out to pasture, bridle and all. She never saw the figure again, but it still shakes her to the bone to even talk about it. Now, growing up, my uncle was a bit of a hooligan and frequently snuck people in his bedroom window. One night, he heard two men having a conversation outside of his bedroom. I should add that his room was on the lower floor of the house, and there was gravel outside of the window covering the ground. As he listens to these men, he hears footsteps in the gravel and someone drop their keys. He decides to open the window and tell whichever his friends were out there to get inside and quiet down. Well, when he looked out there was no one there. He thought someone was messing with him, and he told them to basically fuck off or show themselves. He heard nothing in response and figures it was one of his friends being a dick. He eventually went back to bed, only to hear the conversation start up again. At this point, he started to feel freaked. He got a gun and went outside only to find nothing. Well, I guess he thought it was over and life moved on. Over time, though, every year around fall, I think, this same event would take place. The conversation, the footsteps in the gravel, and the keys dropping. He apparently just got used to it somehow. Once I was born, my uncle had already moved out, and lo and behold, that became my room. I never heard the keys, but on multiple occasions I did hear footsteps in the gravel, and both my mom and I heard a conversation on the downstairs porch. It was a man and a woman this time. We figured it was my grandparents outside enjoying the nice night. That morning, when we asked them about it, they were insistent that the time we thought we heard them, they were sleeping in bed. We were freaked out. Another thank you to Chi-Chi Loves Me for posting that story. It's another one of those areas, Manassas, Battle of Bull Run, absolutely swarming with spiritual activity thanks to the Civil War. And also that last story told by her aunt riding the horse smells a little squatchy to me. I don't know if that's just me, but I would imagine something big, hulking black, filling you with dread, hiding in the trees. It's probably the wild man. Our next story comes to us from a user named Varion, entitled Help with Identifying an Obscure Appalachian Spirit/Creature. Hey guys, first time posting on this sub. I'm reaching out to see if anyone can point me towards any info about a rather strange creature my grandmother told stories about since I was a child, and to this day she still swears it's true. They were never told with the intent to scare us, but rather I always got the notion that it was something she strongly believed and was simply offering as a warning, even when I hear her retell it now in my 30s. The time frame would have been around 1900 through 1915 in southwestern Virginia when this all started, and continued up into the late 30s and early 40s after my grandmother was born. My grandmother lived with her grandparents at the time, and as is custom in the region, it was not uncommon to have several relatives at a household on any given day. Their home was well back in a deep valley, or holler, as we like to call them. The stories always seemed to follow a similar sequence that supposedly happened countless times, and was seen by members of my family and even several neighbors. Sometimes during nights when the moon was full and clear, they'd all be laying asleep, and in a small home with most of the beds in a single room, only to be awakened by something stomping on the roof like it was trying to shake the rafters loose. They'd hear it scratch and stomp around on the roof for several minutes before it would get very quiet, with even the local wildlife hushing up unnaturally. After a little while, they'd hear something thumping the kitchen table like it was dancing, and then the sounds of her grandmother's china cabinet slamming the wall and contents being thrown and broken all over the floor. When they rushed to see what was happening, nothing would be amiss, and the room seemed perfectly normal, every dish in place. One night she says her grandfather and his brother had enough of this and sat up well into the night, shotguns in hand, with a clear moon shining to catch this thing and kill it. Well, sometime after everyone was asleep, and they were still up and waiting, as expected, the roof began to heave violently, and something jumped off and landed in the front yard, making a noise that she describes as sounding like a turkey gobbling, but if the turkey was possessed by the devil himself and as big as a train car. She says it was so loud the house shook. Her grandfather rushed outside to confront it, and could hear its footfalls just feet ahead of him as he chased it down the trail and into the woods. He swore that the moon was so bright he could have seen a rabbit in the weeds from yards away, but he never could see whatever it was that he was chasing, even though he saw grass parting and limbs breaking as it ran ahead of him. He said he could even hear it breathing and screeching. Eventually it just vanished and he was left standing in the dark, and the woods were so quiet you could hear a pin drop. It was a while before anything happened again, and the neighbors across the mountain had heard of this tale in the local community. One of their older sons came over to sit with her grandfather for a few nights to see this thing because he didn't believe a word of it. He was a very serious man and thought maybe her grandfather was suffering a sickness of the mind. They put all the children to bed each night and sat at the hearth way up into the morning with the other adults to wait and see if it would show itself. Bear in mind, up until this point, no one had laid eyes on the thing. It was the middle of the summer, and they had the front door propped open to let the breeze in. The man was the only one facing the door as they were all sitting in chairs talking, and all of a sudden he got up and screamed like he'd been shot and climbed over two women trying to get away from the door, even knocking them to the ground. Grandmother says he was a mild gentleman and very quiet, and she'd never seen anybody so scared. It was completely out of character for him. He was inconsolable, and he swore he saw it looking through the door into the home in the moonlight, but never gave a description, only saying that man never had words made to go with such a thing like that. They moved out of the house sometime after that and never did get any ideas of what it was that was causing all the commotion. But several other folk in the area came forward to report similar events in their homes after her grandfather told this tale to the community. In those days, and with the people as clannish and private as folk in this area are, it's not surprising that they'd be reluctant to share something like this with their neighbors, for fear of being ridiculed at best and thought to be devil worshippers, or cursed at worst. Do any of you have any information pertaining to legends or stories from the region of similar occurrences? I've researched quite a bit online and I can't seem to find anything that matches this description. I would love to know if there's anyone else in the Appalachians that have ever heard about something like this. It's such a strange story, but I know my grandmother is telling the truth when she tells the story. You can see her fear and hear it in her voice. Any help would be appreciated, and thanks for reading. A huge thank you to Varion for bringing this story, passed down through the generations of their family. This is exactly the kind of story I wanted when I started Odd Virginia, the old superstitious type tales. I must say that the creature in question that was plaguing this poor family in their homestead sounds a lot like the Virginian wood booger, sometimes known as the booger man or boogeyman. Nowadays, things have become a lot more, you could say, globalized, and many lines are drawn in parallel to the Bigfoot phenomenon. The wood booger seems to be the term more commonly used before Bigfoot or Sasquatch were popularized. Some similarities include the creature on the roof, running away making a horrifying sound, completely invisible. And often you'll find that paired with these Sasquatch encounters comes a strange poltergeisty-like activity plaguing the house. Maybe that could have been what they were dealing with. Maybe something completely different. We'll never know. Our next story comes to us from a user called WhoPooted82. Entitled, From Convenience to Horror. My year of hell. In 2003, I lived in the southwestern part of Virginia, in a small mountain town. The town had been a coal mining town for generations and had been around since the mid-1800s. After living in the basement of my girlfriend's mother's house for over a year, we decided it was time to get our own place. The place we chose to rent happened to be the second home we looked at. It was a 2-story brick home, that had been around for well over 100 years. It was conveniently located across the street from a bank, a restaurant, and a grocery store. The current owners had remodeled the home to have an apartment on the ground floor and another on the upper floor. The apartment we chose was the ground floor apartment, and although it was $50 more a month, we didn't mind. We signed our 1-year lease and we were ready to move in. As we settled into our new home, things couldn't have been better. No one lived in the other apartment, and it was incredibly peaceful considering its location. For the first month, things were normal aside from little creaks and noises that we associated with the noises of an older home. One night, things changed as fast as the flip of a coin. Sitting in our living room and watching TV, we began to hear defined footsteps walking around in the upstairs apartment. At first, I thought that someone must be moving in upstairs, and we both got excited to see who our new neighbors were. We decided that we should go sit out on our shared front porch and wait for an opportunity to introduce ourselves. After an hour or two, we gave up and went inside and bedded down for the night. For the next week, we continued to hear someone walking around, but never saw our new neighbors. At this time, I worked a job that had me working various different shifts. One particular night, I got home and my girlfriend asked if I could maybe talk to our neighbors about all the noise we were hearing. I obliged and went to knock on the door. After knocking a few times, no one answered, and I gave up. I stepped out front for a cigarette and had a realization that I never saw a moving truck, and no new vehicle was parked out front, and perhaps even more strange, the lights in the apartment never appeared on at night. At the end of the second month, as I dropped off the rent to my landlord, I asked about our new neighbors and was told that the apartment hadn't been rented yet. I told our landlord about the noises, and he said a wild animal must have gotten in somehow, and he would stop by and look into the situation. He came by on a Saturday, and we looked around the empty upstairs apartment, couldn't find any sign of anything. He told me it must be the noises of an old house, and I just had to accept that. I knew there had to be more going on, but I saw for myself that nothing could be making those noises. Life continued, and so did the footsteps. A few weeks later, we had some friends over for dinner and drinks, and the footsteps started again. My best friend started to remark about how loud our neighbors were, and I filled him in on what was going on. He was convinced that someone must be breaking into that apartment at night. With a little bit of liquid courage, we found a creative way to get the door open and went to inspect. Once again, the apartment was empty, and I was at a loss. We locked the vacant apartment, and that is when the conversation came up about the house possibly being haunted. At this point, there could be no other explanation, and this was something that we would just have to accept. This conversation went on for a few hours between myself, my girlfriend, and our two best friends. In retrospect, I wish this conversation and exploration never happened, as the following day everything got worse. Our friends got up the next day and headed home. We decided to walk across the street to the grocery store and spent the next hour shopping. Upon returning home, we unlocked the door and walked into our apartment to discover every door and cabinet in the house was standing wide open. This sent chills up my spine. From this point forward, we had a routine of checking everything before we left the home. Every time we came home, something was wrong. We experienced doors being opened or closed when they shouldn't be. Lights and fans would turn off or on their own, and this wasn't an electrical issue as the switches themselves would be flipped. The more this happened, the more we became concerned, but we were under a lease, and although the events were strange, it didn't seem malicious, so we stayed. As the days went on, things got worse. One evening, I was sitting in our spare bedroom, which is where our computer was located. My girlfriend comes walking in asking what I need. Me, being confused by this, asked what she meant, and she said that she had heard me call her name. I told her that I had not called for her, and she accused me of trying to prank or scare her. The following night, I'm back in the spare bedroom, and I hear her call my name. I got up and went to see what was needed. She hadn't called for me, and again accused me of trying to scare her. At this point, I'm starting to get really concerned, as disembodied voices cannot be a good thing. This continued for as long as we lived there, and it got to the point that my girlfriend would say my name and I would ignore her as I thought it wasn't going to be her. For most, this would have been enough, but yet we stayed. After about another 4 months of living there, we received a knock at the door. I answered and was greeted by a nice lady that was around the same age as myself and my girlfriend. She stated that she had lived there before the remodeling and how much she loved the apartment. We agreed that it was nice, but asked her if she'd experienced anything odd while living there. She quite frankly said, "Oh, you mean the ghosts?" We replied that yes, we were talking about ghosts. She stated that the house was most definitely haunted, and she used to contact the ghost on a Ouija board when she lived there. Then she asked if we would be willing to move into the upstairs apartment and let her have our apartment, as she wanted to move back to the home but couldn't handle the stairs due to her being pregnant. I politely declined as my girlfriend was partially disabled after a car accident, and we chose this apartment specifically due to that fact. I could tell the girl was disappointed in hearing this, but she was so cordial and gave us her number in case we changed our minds or if we decided to move so that we could let her know. For the next month, things continued. They didn't escalate, but they didn't get better either. At this time, the girl who appeared at our door a month ago was back. She informed us that she was moving into the upstairs apartment and appealed to us again to switch apartments. We politely declined, and she proceeded to move in. For the next month, things seemed to get better. Neither of us heard the voices, the issues with the doors and lights stopped, and any footsteps upstairs could now be justified. Just as we got used to the normal life in the house, the activity started again, and was worse than ever. Now we had to deal with all of the issues from before, and now new things were happening as well. At times you would feel breathing on the back of your neck, only for no one to be behind you. We started seeing shadows move out of the corners of our eyes and began to have issues with light bulbs burning out prematurely and batteries into our devices draining at an unexplainable rate. At this point, we have less than 6 months left on our lease and had decided that we were moving when our lease ended. The experience we had in this apartment put a massive strain on our relationship. At this point, my girlfriend was doing everything in her power not to stay in that house alone while I was working. On multiple occasions, she went to her mom's house and stayed there for a few days at a time. Every time she stayed at her mom's, she asked me to stay with her instead of staying in the house alone. But that would have added an hour to my commute each day. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared, but I did it anyway. One morning I woke up after a long and mostly sleepless night. As I lay in bed trying to wake up, I hear footsteps in my apartment, and I know I'm home alone. As I quietly get out of bed, I see my girlfriend walk past the bedroom door. This surprised me as I didn't expect her to be there. I get up and I walk in to find out what she's doing home and realize that she's not there. I frantically call her and explain that I just saw her in the apartment. She tries to calm me down but explains that it wasn't her, as she was still at her mom's over half an hour away. Now I'm scared and I feel alone. I decided that this was too much and appealed for my girlfriend to come stay with me as we would have strength in numbers. She declined and said that ghosts and/or demons don't care about numbers. To deal with my stress, I turned to smoking cannabis so I could relax. It did not relax me at all. If anything, it made my anxiousness worse. It did, however, help me sleep a lot better, so I made it a routine before going to bed. One night, the guy who I used to buy my cannabis from stopped by to drop some off to me. I gave him my address and told him to knock when he got there. Instead of getting a knock at the door, I got a phone call from him. He says that he's out front and that I shouldn't be sitting at home alone and I should come hang out with him for a while. I agree and head out the door to meet him. We get in his car, and as we pull away, he tells me to move out of that place now. I, of course, asked him why, and he said that if he told me everything he knew about that place, I would never step foot inside again. I pushed for more info, but he wouldn't tell me. Now I'm truly terrified, but also curious as to what had happened in that house. At this point, I have maybe 2 months left on the lease, and I'm spending every night online looking for info about this house. One night, a guy I work with came by to help me with my search. I was amazed at how much he helped me discover in such a short period of time. We found out the age of the home, a picture of the home that was so old that the main street in front of my house wasn't a road, but instead railroad tracks. We also found a news article talking about a fire in the house and the death of the occupant during the fire. Once we found this article and started to read it, we both began to hear the voices of what sounded like 10 kids playing on my front porch. I jumped up and went to look to see what was going on, and the moment I opened the front door, the noise stopped and I found no one on my front porch. My friend from work was so freaked out by this, he left immediately and refused to ever step into that house again. At this point, I'm now volunteering for overtime at work, so I just don't have to be at home. One day I came home to find a moving truck sitting out front, and my upstairs neighbor was moving out as the stairs were adding complications to her pregnancy. She informed me that her mother would be by the following day to pick up the last few items that were left. This night was strange due to how peaceful everything suddenly became. No noises, no voices, nothing. That night I had the best night of sleep possible. The following day comes and I'm outside mowing the grass when the mother of the other tenant arrives. I greeted her and we talked briefly about her daughter and the soon-to-be baby. After a few moments we parted ways and she went inside to gather the rest of her daughter's belongings. I offered to help, but she declined, so I decided to stick close by just in case. After 2 trips to her car, she looked at me and stated that she had only a few pillows left to load up, and how she couldn't wait to walk out of that creepy house for the final time. We had conversations previously about the haunting. About 2 minutes after she went inside, I heard a scream and the sound of something tumbling down the steps. I went to investigate, and the mother had apparently fallen down the steps. As I went to help her, she asked me to get her away from that house and said something forcefully pushed her down the steps. I helped her to the car and she asked if I could grab the pillows that she dropped as she fell. She stated that if I didn't feel comfortable that they could just stay behind. Tempting to be Mr. Macho Man, I told her I'd get them for her and proceeded back into the house. I reached the top of the stairs, grabbed the pillows, and ran back downstairs. I slammed the door closed and returned to the mother. She was visibly shaken and had bruises appearing. I asked if she wanted to go to the hospital, and she declined, but asked if I would drive her car home, and said she would have her husband bring me back home. I knew she was in no shape to drive, so I agreed. After a 10-minute drive, I dropped her off, and her husband returned me to the house. Now I am really alone in a house that I know can hurt people. That night before I went to bed, I stepped out on the front porch for a cigarette. As I go back inside, I notice the door to the upstairs apartment is standing wide open. One half of me wanted to just pull that door closed, while the other half of me thought I needed to make sure no one was up there. I knew that I had closed the door earlier, and I feel like if it had been open, that I would have just noticed during one of my other times outside that evening. Ultimately, I decided to go upstairs and check everything out. As soon as I arrive at the top of the stairs, I hear an unnatural voice say, "Leave." I ran down the steps as fast as humanly possible, locked the door to the upstairs apartment, and returned to my apartment more scared than I have ever been. After tossing and turning for several hours, I finally managed to fall asleep. When I woke up the next day, my front door was standing wide open. It had 2 locks, one on the doorknob and a deadbolt that could only be operated from the inside of the apartment. Both locks were in the locked position, yet the door was standing wide open. I'm losing my mind right at this point. Having around 5 weeks left on the lease, I don't feel safe here at all. I know I'm not spending an entire day in this house alone, so I decided to shower and get ready to leave for the day. When I turn on the water, nothing happens. I decided to call the landlord as the water was included in the rent. I went onto the back porch to call him while I smoked, and I realized that the stairwell going into the basement is filled with water. I call the landlord and he states that he's out of town and that he keeps a key to the basement hidden in each of the apartments in case of emergency. I get the key and shut off the water to the house. While doing so, I realized that a plastic or PVC pipe had broken. I knew I could fix it, so I offered to do so. The hour that I spent in the basement was horrible. Nothing happened while I was down there, but I was totally creeped out. I got very strange feelings that I was being watched, or that something was going to jump out and attack me. I finished the job and finally got my shower. I decided to go to my girlfriend's mom's house for the night, as I was far too stressed. The following day after I got off work, I went back to the apartment with the realization that I only have a month left in this place. I had dinner that night and sat down to watch TV. In the middle of my show, my TV went black. Then it flashed white and went back to black. All except for the letters D-I-E. This lasted for 5 to 10 seconds and the TV powered off on its own and would not turn back on. The following day, I dropped the TV off at a repair shop on my way back to work. The TV was just a little over a year old. After I got off, I swung back by the repair shop and was informed that they couldn't find anything technically wrong with the TV, but that it would not power on. This was the final straw. The following day, I went to the bank and applied for a small home loan that was approved. I only entered that apartment one more time, the day I moved out. The experiences I have stuck with me, and although I have lived in many different places in my life, No place sticks in my mind like this one does. I feel lucky that I was never physically hurt, but the mental toll of something like this can stick with you forever. Hope you enjoyed my story. This is my first Reddit experience, and I hope I didn't break any rules. Sorry my story is so long, and thanks for reading about it, everyone. All right, and that's it for tonight, folks. I just want to thank everybody who tuned in, and also want to thank everybody who posted their stories to Reddit. I'm incredibly grateful I was able to find a plethora of stories on Reddit based in Virginia, and, I was just scratching the surface. There's a whole lot more. All of those stories came from the subreddit called Paranormal, and there are many other subreddits I can draw from. I know there are some subreddits out there where people kind of post made-up creepypastas, and usually those are pretty easy to weed out and tell what it is, and I also know which subreddits have a lot of those and kind of stay away from them. I prefer the authentic experience, and I also prefer, listening to someone tell their own story due to the authenticity of that. I'm not able to convey the emotions that they were feeling at the time by reading their stories. So, with that said, if anybody does have a story and wants to share it with me on the show or in private, it doesn't really matter. Or if you have any knowledge of local legends or weird history based in Virginia, I'd love to hear from you. So go ahead and send me an email. The address is oddvirginia@protonmail.com. That's oddvirginia@protonmail.com. Please reach out to me and just let me know your story. If anonymity is your thing, I know it's kind of daunting to get in front of a microphone and share your story, your address, and your social security number. No, I don't ask you for all that, but it can be kind of daunting to be interviewed about, sensitive topics like this. So if you want to, you can always give me a fake name. We can change your voice, whatever. Just get in touch with me, because I think that people really enjoy this pursuit of knowledge of the unknown, as I do. Every little bit shared helps to get us a little bit further along the line of figuring that stuff out. Will we ever figure it out? To be honest, I don't think so. It's all just too crazy. It's just too weird to get to the bottom of. But the more we get into it, the more we know about it, the more we might be able to understand it. So please, go ahead and share your story. The music you heard as the intro track for this episode was a song called Residual Energy. I did this for my Gigabyte project, which is sort of like a dark electronic project that I have. It's sort of a side project. And the album was called Skin and Metal. It's a System Shock 2 tribute album. System Shock 2 being a video game. So all those creepy voices and stuff you hear come from that video game. It's wonderfully immersive, extremely creepy, and perfect if you like old school first-person shooters with a creepy sort of roleplay atmosphere. But yeah, if you want to listen to any more of that, I'm going to go ahead and post a link in the show notes to the Gigabyte project, so you can check out Skin and Metal or any of the other tunes I've made, all that dark electronic stuff, if that's your thing. You'll definitely like it. And yeah, that's about it. Y'all have a great October and a good night. Bye.
happened to me.